the last time we were together, we studied Daniel chapter 5. And that story, if you remember, ended in a heartbreaking way. It was one of the saddest stories in Daniel. Most of the stories ended with God doing something amazing and people learning from it as a result and becoming closer to God or being a witness for God. But this story was a story of King Belshazzar. He had not learned the lessons of humility that his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had learned the hard way. And when the king finally calls him, all that Daniel can do is pronounce judgment on the king. Babylon was done. As a leader, he had gone too far. God had worked in his life as much as he could. He couldn't work anymore. Belshazzar wouldn't listen to him. In the last verses that we read in Daniel chapter 5 and verse 30, that very night, Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, was killed. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom at the age of 62. You can turn with me, please, to Daniel chapter 6, where we'll be in today. But that is where we left off of that heartbreaking story of a man who refused to learn humility, was proud and was focused on his own things, not on anything that anyone else, that God wanted him to do. Daniel 6 picks right up at the beginning of King Darius' reign. The first big thing that he does is to restructure the leadership of Babylon. It's no longer Babylon, but now this is the combined kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. Cyrus and Darius were over the two groups, but they were King Darius was the main guy, I guess you could say. Those 120 men in this new kingdom that he was setting up over what used to be Babylon answered to 3 administrators, 3 presidents, if you will, over those leaders of the kingdom. Daniel was chosen as one of those 3. Now it seems a bit strange that someone who had just been named to this position the night of the fall of Babylon by the Babylonian king was appointed to basically the same position in the new kingdom. It seems very strange that would be the case. Normally, you would think that they would wipe out whoever was at the top, like they did to King Darius, to King Belshazzar. But Daniel was really a special person. This was the 4th king, the 2nd kingdom that he had served under as a very high leader in that kingdom. He was an incredibly wise leader that was respected by everybody that worked with him, that he worked under. We pick up the story in verse 3. Daniel distinguished himself above the administrators and satraps because he had an extraordinary spirit. So the king planned to set him over the whole realm. Doesn't it sound like what Belshazzar had said, that he was putting him over everybody, including the people that were supposed to be in the position of leadership? This apparent favoritism did not go unnoticed by Daniel's subordinates and also his peers. They didn't really like it. But the king didn't notice Daniel because he was pushing for a higher position. He wasn't trying to climb the ladder and the king took notice, I'm going to put you in this position because you want this position. Daniel was humble. The Bible said that in the verse we just read that what set him apart was that he had an extraordinary spirit. Maybe Darius hadn't seen somebody like that before. It was something different. It wasn't normal. It wasn't what everybody else that was under him was like. Some of the people under him, under Daniel, did not like that Daniel was in a position in line for a promotion that they wanted to get. So that Daniel wouldn't just be one of the 3 administrators. He would be the chief of the administrators over the 120. Let's go to verse 4. The administrators and satraps, therefore, kept trying to find a charge against Daniel regarding the kingdom. But they could find no charge or corruption, for he was trustworthy, and no negligence or corruption was found in him. Then these men said, we will never find any charge against this Daniel unless we find something against him concerning the law of his God. The leaders who opposed Daniel, they tried desperately to find anything that would disqualify him from serving in the kingdom. They were combing through every detail of his life, both his public service and his private life, anything that they could pick apart, trying to find something that they could use against him. But they couldn't find a single thing wrong with anything that Daniel had done in the past or anything that he was doing. They couldn't find anything against him. Daniel was blameless in every area of his life. He was honest, he was dependable, he did his job well. They couldn't pick apart his job the way that they wanted to. For Daniel, integrity was not just something that he did to look good on the outside. It's easy sometimes to look like you have integrity. You put on a front on the outside. But for Daniel, integrity was a strong commitment to godly principles that did not change depending on who was watching him or what situation he was in. That integrity stayed the same in any situation, no matter what it was, both in his private life and it showed in his public life. He was just faithfully consistent, and he was also consistently faithful in everything he did. Daniel's life shows us that integrity is not just avoiding trouble just because somebody might see it. Just keep it secret, keep it hidden away. Daniel was about being faithful to God's ways no matter what. And his faith affected every decision he made, every conversation he had, every act he did. His faith guided every choice that he did. In other words, these enemies of Daniel concluded, we can't get him in trouble for doing anything wrong. So since we can't find anything wrong with him, let's try to get in trouble for being too faithful to his God. Imagine having people realize that your worst flaw is being faithful to your God. More faithful to God than to anything else. That's his worst flaw. His enemies came up with a scheme hoping to trap him. They knew he was faithful in worshiping God, and maybe, they thought, he would still have the courage to kneel as he always did and pray to God when so much was at stake. His life would be at stake, as we're going to see here in a little bit. In verse 6, this was their plan that they put together. So the administrators and the satraps went together to the king and said to him, "May King Darius live forever. All the administrators of the kingdom, the prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an edict that for 30 days, anyone who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den. Therefore, your majesty, establish the edict and sign the document so that as a law of the Medes and Persians, it is irrevocable and cannot be changed." So King Darius signed the written edict. Now Darius was flattered that all his counselors were wanting to honor him in this way. It didn't even occur to him that Daniel wasn't on that list. They said all the administrators, and they listed Daniel was one of those administrators. Didn't even occur to him that he was trying to trap him, that they were trying to trap him in this, that would get him in big trouble. The officials knew how committed Daniel was to his God. The king knew, as we'll see later, the king fully knew how committed Daniel was to his God. And these officials, as soon as he signed this law that could not be changed, that was something in their legal system, even the king could not change a law that he put into motion. It was, if a law was signed, if a law was, that signet ring was on that law, nothing could change it. Did not matter what it was or what the repercussions were, it could not be changed. These officials rushed to see what Daniel would do. They knew what he would do. This is why they put him in this situation. In verse 10, this is his response. When Daniel learned that the document had been signed, he went into his house. The windows in its upstairs room opened toward Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he got down on his knees, prayed, and gave thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Daniel's courage to kneel was not something that he just started just because he ran into a crisis. It wasn't something that he just felt the need that he needed to do because he was in trouble. This was something that he had always done. It was a habit of his. And because of that, he wasn't shaken by any threats or by fear of what might happen. He's calm. Well, let me ask you this. If you were in a situation where staying faithful to God, where praying to God in a way that people saw you would get you in this kind of trouble, would your first reaction be, I'm going to go kneel and I'm going to give thanks to God? I don't think that would be mine. I hope it would be. I pray it would be. But this was Daniel's first reaction. His life was on the line if he did not stop praying to the God that he loved. And so the first thing he did was, I'm going to go give thanks to God. Daniel had other options, didn't he? Couldn't he just have gone somewhere private to pray? It was just for 30 days. He'd still be praying to God. He wouldn't be losing his obedience. He wouldn't be unobedient to God. It wasn't like God had come down and ordered him, you have to pray in front of this window every day, 3 times a day. That wasn't something that God had told him that he had to do, but he could have prayed quietly, out of sight, just so he wouldn't get in trouble for those 30 days, but he didn't. He refused to put on an act which, if he had gone and prayed in private, he would have been, and he knew this, he would have been telling those men who were after him, I'm going to change how I live my relationship with God based on your threats and based on your demands. This wasn't a putting on a show. This wasn't Daniel trying to prove a point. This was simply what he did every single day, 3 times a day. It was part of his relationship with God, and he was not going to change any aspect of his relationship with God, even if his life was on the stake. His faith was such an important part of his life that he could not imagine changing it, even though he'd probably die as a result. Daniel was fully willing to obey the king. He wasn't being rebellious. He respected authority. He could not have gotten this far as a leader in the kingdom without respecting the authority of the king. He obeyed him in every area that he could. He fulfilled every duty asked of him, unless it asked him to betray his faith in God. That was where he drew the line. Everything else he went along with. He respected that authority. But he knew where his loyalty lay. Didn't matter what happened, nothing, not even a death sentence, could get him to even shift his loyalty a little bit, or appearance of loyalty even. Nothing could compromise his loyalty to God. Now these spies eagerly reported Daniel's actions to Darius. They were probably a little bit too excited when they ran back into the palace. They reminded the king that this was a law you could not change. That, remember, you signed this law just the other day. You signed this law. You can't change this law. There's a man that's Daniel. You know him. He's the one that you're trying to make in charge of everybody. Well, he just broke that law. Darius suddenly realized he'd been tricked. He'd been lied to. He desperately tried to figure out a way to save Daniel. He couldn't. He was also bound by the law that he made, no matter how ridiculous it was or how he had signed that law. It was a done deal. He could do nothing to change it. And the officials made sure to remind him that there was nothing he could do. Apparently, King Darius knew that this extraordinary spirit that Daniel had was something that came only because of his faithfulness to his God. He knew that. That was why, I believe, the big reason why he respected Daniel so much, especially after this. I'm sure that Daniel had many opportunities to witness to him. You're pretty much the second in command to the king. You're going to have lots of time to talk and talking through the issues of the kingdom. And Daniel was not shy about his faith. We already know that from the other stories that we read. He respected Daniel's decision to serve his God. And this was what the king told him as Daniel was being thrown into the lion's den. Verse 16. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you." Imagine that, coming from a king who was not a follower of God, but he knew the power of Daniel's God. I'm sure he'd heard the stories of the previous kings and the things that had happened, the stories that we read previously in Daniel. May the God whom you serve rescue you. The king was unable to eat or sleep that whole night. He could not do anything. He was so distressed over what he was pretty sure he had killed a trusted advisor. His reaction seems a little bit closer than just an advisor. It seems like Daniel was a really close friend to him. This was a major loss to this king. Early the next morning, as soon as that law where he couldn't get past as soon as he could get past the law, what the law said, the king rushed to the sealed entrance of that tomb. And in verse 20, in the lion's den, and in verse 20, when he reached the den, he cried out in anguish to Daniel, "Daniel, servant of the living God," the king said, "has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to rescue you from the lions?" I can imagine him waiting for a response. There wouldn't be any logical reason for there to be a voice that came out of that. Those lions were hungry. They were starving. We see that later in the story. Those lions were absolutely starving. Wouldn't expect anybody to have a voice come out of there, but he is crying out, did your God, whom you continually serve, has he been able to rescue you? Is he strong enough to save you from these lions? Verse 21, from out of that den, out of the darkness, then Daniel spoke with the king. "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they haven't harmed me, for I was found innocent before him. And also before you, your majesty, I have done no harm." The men who had falsely accused Daniel, along with their families, once Daniel was pulled out safely without a touch, no lion had even scratched him. Those men that had falsely accused him, along with their families, were thrown into that den, were very quickly taken care of, what they originally intended for Daniel to experience. And after this, King Darius wrote a decree in praise to the God of Daniel. Verse 25, then King Darius wrote to those of every people, nation, and language who live on the whole earth, "May your prosperity abound. I issue a decree that in all my royal dominion people must tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. For he is a living God. He endures forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his dominion has no end. He rescues and delivers. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. For he has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. God didn't stop Daniel's enemies from throwing him into this den of lions. God allowed them to go to a point. But he did this to make Daniel's rescue even more incredible, even more of a statement of the power of Daniel's God. It made so much more of a widespread witness of who God was than it would have if he had just silently kept Daniel from getting thrown in by whatever other reason it might have been. Sometimes we forget that God is able to take things that Satan does or instigates and turn it around so that it's actually somehow God is able to do something even more powerful despite and through what Satan has done. Satan's trying to knock out something that God's doing, and God's like, you know what? I'm actually going to be able to work in a bigger way because of what you did. Daniel was a man of integrity. But where did this integrity come from? The number one key to developing integrity is consistency in your relationship with God. And from the first time that we see Daniel in Babylon, in Daniel chapter 1, we watch him determine that he will not be defiled by a pagan king, by his lifestyle, by his anything that he wants to make him do, by his culture or anything. And then we see how that integrity is rewarded. This is back in the beginning of Daniel. And we see this again all the way through his life. And this is many years later that this happens in Daniel chapter 6. He's an old man now, gone through 3-4 different kings by this point. You know, integrity does not happen overnight. Something that develops little by little, day by day, minute by minute. Something that's built over time as you consistently connect with God. You allow Him to shape your character, you allow Him to shape your values. And when you spend that regular, intentional time with God, through prayer, through studying His Word, through listening to Him speak to you, through His guidance, His principles, God's principles, become part of you. They become actually part of your life. There may be other ways to look like you have integrity, of being a good person, but this is the only way to actually have integrity that goes through your entire life, through every part of you. This habit of spending time with God shapes your everything that you do, what you talk about, what you share with others, the things that you do, every aspect of your life, every element of your life, because your commitment to God is evident in everything you do. It shows out in everything that you do. This consistency in the little things creates a foundation so that when pressures come, when trials come, you no longer are reacting from a place of fear or even possibly compromise. How can I kind of fudge this a little bit so that I don't look the way that I don't get in trouble for staying faithful? Instead of responding from fear and compromise, you instead begin to respond from faith when you have that foundation. You know, Daniel's commitment to prayer, it wasn't just a daily, it wasn't just a routine. It was an actual essential part of his relationship with God. If it was just a routine, he could have changed that for a few days. If something is, it's easy to change a routine for a short amount of time and you go right back to it. But this was an essential part of his relationship with God. And living in a foreign land with the constant pressures to conform to everything around him, to the culture, to the different values that were around him, Daniel's time with God became his lifeline. That was the only way he could survive. He prayed 3 times a day with his window open toward Jerusalem. It was a reminder of what God had promised, as a reminder of his faithfulness to his people, knowing that that's where God's temple is, that's where God's house is, praying toward the place that they would return very soon as God had promised. This habit of devotion was much more than a ritual. It was a relationship with God. It was as an integral part of relationship with a God that he loved and honored more than everyone or anything else. Now, if your time with God becomes something that's just another thing in your to-do list, that's on the other extreme of it. That's just a routine, just something you check off because, I need to do this. I read my page today. You're missing the depth of what God intends. Something that he wants throughout the day, your time with him. It's something that he wants consistently, to be able to speak to you, for you to speak to him. Like Daniel, you should approach your connection with God not as a routine or as something that you have to do every single day, but as intentionally growing a relationship with someone that you long to become more like. And when you consistently turn to God, that foundation I was talking about earlier, it trains you to rely on him throughout the day. It becomes a habit of where everything that you come across, good or bad, or somewhere in the middle, your first instinct is to turn to God. And by keeping your focus on God, you become aware of his presence. You become aware of where he's working in your life. You become aware of where he's working in the lives of the people around you. even in a world that often rejects anything to do with God. Daniel did not start praying because of the decree and his fear of that decree. He prayed because it was already one of the most important times of his day. He wouldn't let anything get in the way of that. When a daily habit of turning to God is in place, it prepares you for any challenge that comes your way. It's not like a magic time where if I have my time with God, my day is going to go well. That's another wrong way to look at it, because that's definitely not going to happen. But it gives you that foundation so that your automatic response of no matter what I'm facing, I'm turning to God right now, prepares you for the times of trial so that you're more ready to respond in faith rather than fear. More ready to respond in faith rather than in compromise of your position or your relationship with Him, because your heart is already set on Him. There's nothing that can change that. It's already there. It's already focused on Him. And this is my appeal to you this morning. Will you make this your experience? Will you set this habit? If you don't have it already, if you do, then this is a recommitment to allow God to continue this to be a habit in your life, that nothing get in the way of it. But if you haven't already, will you start today? Will you allow God to give you that solid spiritual foundation? So when trials hit you, which they will, they do, you're not going to be afraid. You're not going to be shook. It's not for very long. That might be your first instinct, but then immediately you turn to God and He's able to give you the peace and the comfort that you need for whatever you're going through. And the experience of Daniel can be the experience of each one of us here in this room today.